A young woman who lived with her boyfriend in an apartment was kidnapped on the eve of Christmas. The young man was restrained by an unidentified criminal, who also took the young woman outside through the back door before vanishing into thin air. The caveman went unpunished for 36 years before an unexpected truth came to light because the police were unable to identify the perpetrator. Leslie McRae was born in Jacksonville, Florida, on April 14, 1968. She had a great sense of humor, was tenacious, outgoing, and kind. She also loved to have fun. Leslie was brought up in a loving family, but was especially close to her younger cousin Joey, who was 4 years old. The girls made an effort to get together as often as they could despite living in different cities. When she turned 18, Leslie even considered relocating to her hometown. Leslie enrolled in the University of North Florida when she turned 17 and completed high school with the goal of pursuing a career in modeling. On the evening of December 24, 1985, she and her 21-year-old boyfriend, Edgar McQuarrie, moved out of her parents' home and into an apartment building. Around 3 in the morning, Edgar heard a noise in their apartment where they were sleeping. He was horrified to see a man with a knife standing over their bed. Edgar's hands and feet were bound with ties, and the unidentified criminal threatened him with a weapon to keep him from defending himself. Leslie was then led outside the apartment through the back door after being similarly bound. Still restrained, Edgar could do nothing but watch in horror as the kidnapper took Leslie. He had to spend 3 hours getting his hands free before calling the police at around 6 o'clock. Considering that the room was nearly pitch black when Leslie was taken, I took Edgar's advice and started looking for her. With the exception of brown hair, Edgar was unable to make out the perpetrator's face or any other distinguishing characteristics. Although it was obvious that the kidnapper had used a means of transportation to kidnap Leslie, the police were unsure of the type of vehicle he had used. They were looking for witnesses and scanning the street when they got a call at their station. 8 kilometers from Leslie's apartment, 3 hours after the kidnapping, a man who was out for a morning run came across a woman's body lying in a ditch next to the road. As soon as detectives arrived on the scene, they recognized the young woman. There were numerous wounds all over her body. Her clothes were missing or torn in some places. The young woman had more than 20 wounds from sharp objects, according to medical professionals, and she also had numerous bruises all over her body. In addition, the killer had, despite the fact that DNA analysis wasn't widely used in those days, experts were able to extract his biological material. Since there were no other helpful hints at the scene and this evidence could not be used to identify a suspect, the police decided to concentrate on looking into the victim's apartment as soon as possible. They had significant reservations about what had transpired that evening. The victim's boyfriend claimed that the intruder had entered the apartment stealthily, but there were no signs of a break-in in there. There were no indications of a struggle inside the rooms. The back door through which Leslie was allegedly taken out was also covered in cobwebs. No fingerprints were discovered on it, and despite a thick layer of dust surrounding it, there were no shoe prints. All of this suggested that the boyfriend's account might have been made up, which raised the obvious query: does he have any involvement in the murder? This version did have some subtle differences, though. Investigators questioned whether the boyfriend could have shot and killed his girlfriend, then went back to the apartment and dialed 911. Experts suggested that her body was dumped on the street after Edgar dialed 911. Making him no longer be thought of as a suspect. The detectives searched for new leads over the following few months, but they were unsuccessful on each occasion. As a result, the investigation was ultimately put on hold in 1986. The only significant evidence in this case was the criminal's biological material, which the investigators hoped would eventually help them identify the murderer. Leslie's kin never gave up hope of solving this case, even though it languished in the records for many years gathering dust. They contacted numerous authorities and independently gathered data that might have been helpful in cracking the case, but due to resource constraints, they were unable to uncover any fresh leads. Sarah Adams, Leslie's mother, diagnosed with a severe nervous system condition that essentially robbed her of her ability to speak. She nevertheless kept in touch with the investigators via notes. Following that, Leslie's cousin Joey took the lead in the investigation. She frequently traveled to Jacksonville, even though she and her family lived 2 hours away, to speak with investigators or assist Leslie's mother. However, attempts to contact the police essentially failed. Detectives were hesitant to reopen They weren't in a rush to take on a decades-old murder case given the lack of fresh evidence and the fact that they were preoccupied with ongoing criminal investigations. As a result, Joey started to charge the detectives with being careless in the initial phases of the investigation or even covering up the offender. Even though she lacked any proof, she speculated that the murderer might have paid off the detectives. In an effort to raise awareness of the case, Joey also regularly gave interviews to local news outlets. She recalled their time together and characterized Leslie as an upbeat and optimistic person. She also regretted that her 2 kids would have never known what a wonderful Aunt Leslie could have been to them. The first outcomes were achieved by her relatives' persistent efforts in late 2018. They got in touch with representatives of the Cold Case Files Initiative, who became intrigued by Leslie's case. This nonprofit, which was founded in 2015, focuses on homicides that have gone unsolved and in which police have been unable to find the culprits. The group gathers and disseminates data, converses with investigators and the media, and supports the victims' loved ones by giving them guidance on how to speak with law enforcement and the media. Employees of the company posted information about Leslie's murder on various websites in an effort to raise as much awareness of the case as they could. Public interest may be crucial in such cases, where investigators have now been able to crack the case. The likelihood that potential witnesses to the events will be among them increases as more people learn about this crime. Unknowingly, people may occasionally have witnessed or heard something that could have helped the police find the murderer. Second, as a result of pressure from the public and the media, the likelihood that detectives would reopen the investigation rose over time. They had the perpetrator's biological material, but studying it required reopening the case, which police officers frequently do not do due to a lack of personnel or funding. Through months of collaboration with Leslie's family, the organization was able to successfully bring attention to this case. In June 2019, representatives of a well-known local TV channel contacted the family. They had written about it in the news, discussed it in reports, and written about it. They offered to film a sizable interview in which relatives could talk about Leslie and their years-long quest for the truth. The offer was accepted, and her mother and cousin met with reporters. They revealed to them Leslie's personality and demonstrated her to them photos and were shocked to learn that the police had not been looking into the case for more than 30 years. In addition, family members said during the interview that they thought the boys Leslie mentioned were her killers and that they did not believe her account of a man with a knife. The journalist chose to omit this scene because Edgar was not a suspect in this case and there was no evidence against him. However, the boy could have killed her himself. The TV channel contacted the sheriff's office in an effort to get more details, but the police refused to provide any. They cited policies that forbade them from speaking with journalists about cases that were not currently under investigation. This result disappointed Leslie's family, but they were not going to give up. Joey persisted in sending letters to the detectives asking them to reopen the case, and in the end it worked. The family was able to arrange a meeting with law enforcement officials, and detectives revealed their intention to revive the investigation. In April 2020, the police re-interviewed the Leslie family and started to review the available evidence. They transported biological samples from the victim's body to a lab, where professionals quickly extracted a DNA profile. This profile was then entered into the FBI's national database and received an instant match. The name of the potential killer was finally known to the investigators almost 35 years later. He was 58. David Nelson Austin. The detectives discovered many intriguing passages in his biography. His DNA was present in since the man had been incarcerated since 1991 for 2 sexual offenses committed in 1988 and 1990. The FBI database was not simply a coincidence. He had just relocated from Florida to Michigan, where he was residing at the time. Leslie was 24 years old and residing in Jacksonville at the time of his death. According to the detectives, he attacked and unsuccessfully tried to assault a young woman who was mentally disabled 2 months prior to the murder. Although the man was detained, the legal system gave his actions very little weight. Austin wasn't given a harsh penalty and continued to be unfettered. He also had a long list of lesser offenses like drug possession and disturbing the peace. More detectives came to the conclusion that he was responsible for Leslie's murder and started putting the case together for court. They went to the Michigan prison to question Austin for the first time in early 2021 after collecting all the required materials. The man denied being involved, but no one was going to take him at his word. Investigators obtained a sample of his DNA to directly compare it with the biological material discovered on the victim's body. This was required as part of the standard procedure, and the outcome was anticipated. A full match. In August 2021, official charges were brought against Austin for Leslie's slaying. Detectives have since been working to transfer him from Michigan to Florida, the scene of the crime. It was necessary to transfer because Florida, as opposed to Michigan, had the death penalty, and Austin might have received it for killing Leslie. It took a year to complete the process. He was currently incarcerated, awaiting trial, and investigators have no doubt that he is guilty until September 2022, when he was finally transferred to a correctional facility in Florida. The only way the murderer can avoid being executed is if they work out a deal with the prosecution and confess to the crime in exchange for another life sentence. Austin was never a suspect in the case and was never interrogated, according to investigators who acknowledged this during a press conference. They claimed the man left no traces that the police could use to identify him. DNA analysis was not possible at the time, and his DNA was only added to the FBI database in 1991, making it impossible to pursue him. Joey stated in an interview she gave 6 years after the murder that she had always thought Leslie's boyfriend was the perpetrator. She didn't realize Edgar was a victim in the narrative until investigators disclosed the identity of the true perpetrator. She is anticipated to be the trial's key witness. She was surprised to hear Leslie's mother say that she had forgiven her daughter's murderer. They were all close relatives, but they all respected her choice. Interestingly, Austin has a son named Owen who he has never met, but they keep in touch frequently via email. When journalists contacted Owen, they discovered that he was horrified by the accusations made against his father. Austin himself wrote to him about it and added that he was not involved in the crime. Meanwhile, despite being fully aware of other criminal incidents in his father's life, his son kept in touch with him. If there are no further developments, Austin's trial is anticipated to start soon. Bureaucratic snags. Despite the fact that the truth has now finally surfaced, he might be sentenced in a few months. The victim's family continues to hold investigators accountable for their negligence, believing that if they had periodically reopened this case, the perpetrator's identity would have been discovered in the early 1990s rather than 30 years later. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. After a walk with friends, the student went back to her house. A short while later, she informed her boyfriend over the phone that someone had arrived at her apartment in a worried tone. She then hung up after promising to call him back, but since she never did, he made the decision to visit her home. The investigation into what happened next became extensive and difficult, with the conclusion coming only 26 years later. On September 19, 1964, in Alameda, California, Angela Somoto was born. The youngest of 5 kids, she was young. Her father passed away when she was a year old, and following her 1982 high school graduation, their mother raised them by herself. In Dallas, Texas, Angela enrolled at Southern Methodist University. She made the decision to major in computer science and electrical engineering, which at the time was not the preferred field for young women. Because of this, Angela was one of the few female students in her class, but this did not stop her from doing well in school and pursuing her career goals. Additionally, Angela had lots of friends. Later, she began dating Ben McCall, an older man who held a managerial position at a construction company and was several years her senior. Angela resided in a residence hall for her first few years of college. Sheila, her roommate at the time, and she eventually became best friends. Angela made the decision to rent an apartment close to the school and settled on a community that is 5 minutes from the campus. She also worked a part-time job to help pay the rent. On October 12, 1984, a Friday night, Angela made the decision to go out with her friends to a bar. She was also invited by the young woman's boyfriend, but he declined because he had to go to work the following morning. Angela decided to go with her friend Anita and Russell, a mutual acquaintance. After having a great time at several bars, they made the decision to return home around 1 in the morning. Since Angela hardly ever drank, she consented to pick up her friends and take them home first. Russell was dropped off close to his apartment. Anita wanted to spend the night at Angela's, but she requested to be picked up early in order to attend a football game. After being taken to the dorm, Angela made the choice to stop by her boyfriend's house for a short while. She entered for a short while before leaving for her house. Ben's house was only a few blocks away from her apartment. He bid Angela farewell and went to bed, but he was awakened 10 minutes later by a call on his landline. Angela answered the phone, and her voice sounded incredibly anxious. She simply asked him to talk to her at first, which struck him as odd. He tried to ask her what the background noise was because he could hear it. She informed him that a man had just knocked on her door and requested to use her phone and restroom. Angela didn't say whether she gave him permission to enter or whether he came into the apartment on his own. "Is there a convenience store with a payphone nearby?" she inquired to Ben. The man gave her the address after looking up a suitable store in the directory. She gave the man this information again and promised to call him back shortly. The call never came after he disconnected. After a brief period of waiting, he began to call her. The construction company had provided Ben with a portable phone, which he kept in his vehicle. When he heard the phone ring, he picked up the phone and walked back to Angela's apartment. However, no one picked up. The young lady might have been accompanying a stranger to the convenience store, he then reasoned. After hearing from the salesperson that no one had visited them, Ben went back to Angela's apartment. He went to the door once more and made the decision to call the police. Before 2 police officers showed up at the house, it had been almost 30 minutes. He gave them an explanation of the situation and asked them to let him into Angela's apartment. However, the officers took no immediate action. Before going inside the apartment, they made the decision to get in touch with the complex's manager and request a key. The police officers' initial observation was, after noticing what they believed to be a shoe on the floor in the center of the living room, they went to the bedroom and discovered an appalling scene. Angela had no clothes on and was sprawled out in a pool of blood on her bed. The police officers noticed numerous stab wounds on her body right away. 18 injuries were later counted by experts. As they started looking over the crime scene, Investigators spotted a number of bloodstains in the bathroom and assumed that they might be the attackers. Several fingerprints were also discovered in the apartment, but they provided no further leads. Detectives discovered that the murderer had taken a kitchen knife, which was likely the murder weapon, to no avail. No evidence of a break-in was present, suggesting that the victim had invited the attacker inside, which was consistent with Ben's account of the strange phone call. Medical professionals were able to remove biological material from the attacker after determining that the victim had been assaulted. The experts could only determine the attacker's blood type in 1984 due to the lack of DNA analysis. Investigators started looking for a suspect and considering all angles of the case. They started by investigating every resident of the complex who might have had access to the apartment. They then looked into local men who had previously been found guilty of violent crimes, but this also turned up no leads. They then turned their attention to Angela's friends and began by questioning her boyfriend. The detectives were not informed of the phone call or the unidentified man who visited Angela by him. The boyfriend agreed to give his fingerprints and a blood sample even though she instantly believed him and thought Ben might have killed her and made up the story. His blood type was determined by experts, who found that it did not match the blood type of the murderer. The victim's ex-boyfriend, whom she dated in her hometown, was another suspect the investigators named after speaking with the victim's friends. He occasionally acted aggressively, and once even threatened her with a knife, according to her friends. His blood type did not match that of the murderer. Because of the killer's blood type, he was no longer seen as a suspect. Russell was the next person the police started to worry about because he had spent time with Angela just before she died. However, the day after the murder, they were unable to find Russell. Further investigation revealed that Russell had attended a friend's wedding on the morning of October 13th before taking a flight to another city to visit family. He was taken to the police station for questioning the following day when he got home. The teenager maintained that he had. Investigators questioned his sincerity despite his claims that he was unrelated to the murder. Russell couldn't confirm whether he was in his apartment that evening because he lived alone. Detectives also discovered that Russell, who was several years Angela's senior and worked as an architect, had a crush on her. Russell tried to ask her out on a date shortly before she passed away after they connected through mutual friends, but she declined because she already had a boyfriend. Detectives were suspicious of their continued friendship and the fact that Russell left town almost a year ago. Given everything, he was quickly identified as the main suspect following the murder, but the new account of his involvement contained inconsistencies. Ben's account stated that an unknown man entered Angela's apartment and was most likely the murderer given the sequence of events. No one else could have killed her and then left the residence. Detectives, however, did not solely base their investigation on Ben's account because they were unable to verify it. In the weeks that followed, Russell was invited in. Some detectives even privately admitted that they were almost certain that he was the murderer after questioning him numerous times, and each time the authorities became more convinced of his potential involvement. The news of Sheila Angela's passing devastated her best friend. She had to move in with her parents because she was terrified of being alone, and for the first month following the murder, she even slept in the same room as them. She called frequently and followed the investigation's development at the same time. Sheila shared information about Angela's friends and acquaintances with the detectives and investigators she met with in an effort to shed light on the situation. In one of these meetings, a detective informed her that although Russell was probably the murderer, there wasn't enough proof to charge him. Then, he requested Sheila meet with him so she could ask him a number of cordial questions, like, what were you doing the days leading up to and immediately following the murder? Investigators wanted to see if his account of a secret compartment matched what he had told them. The young man repeated his story to Sheila while a microphone was attached to her before the meeting, but the detectives weren't about to give up. They called him in for further questioning at the station and offered to administer a polygraph test. Although Russell concurred and passed it, the police still believed he was the murderer. They were so certain of their innocence that they attempted to break the boy during the interrogation by showing him pictures of Angela's corpse, but it had no effect. Russell continued to maintain his innocence despite the fact that this had no effect. He hired a lawyer after 6 months of non-stop questioning and stopped speaking to the police directly. Texas then put him under constant surveillance, but eventually had to turn their focus to looking for other suspects. When Russell went to London to further his architectural education, the investigators were unable to keep track of him. The Angela caves were actively covered in ice during that time. $10,000 was offered as a reward by the family and the media for information leading to the capture of the murderer, but the investigation produced no such information. The same university where Angela attended had another suspect in custody. A few weeks prior to the murder, this man is said to have had a crush on the young woman and sent her irate letters. This information was provided to investigators as an unconfirmed lead. Nevertheless, the detectives were unable to corroborate any of this, and the young man has since had a trustworthy alibi. For many years, the police had no fresh leads, and all of the old leads were dead ends. Sheila made the decision to call the police station and find out the status of the investigation after 10 years of silence. She had already been married and had 2 kids by that point. Even though her life went on, she was unable to forget the tragic death of her best friend or the fact that the offender had not yet received justice. When she spoke with the detectives, they informed her that have they attempted to extract DNA samples from the murderer's biological material? Sheila asked in reference to the case. After all, DNA analysis technology was already being actively used by the police in 1994. The evidence in this case, according to the investigators, was lost and was not retrievable. Sheila kept calling the detectives on a regular basis because she was unsatisfied with their responses. She called more than 700 times over several years, but each time she got the same canned responses. She even attempted to pay for DNA on her own, analysis of every last piece of evidence in a personal lab, but was not permitted to. She was an ordinary citizen, so her initiative was not taken seriously because she had no affiliation with the police. Then Sheila had an insight. She considered becoming a licensed private investigator. This, in her opinion, would give her more effective control over how the investigation was conducted. She started researching this topic, and after a while, she was able to pass the test. She got her license. Despite this, she was unsuccessful in getting detectives to reopen the case, so she kept calling until July 2006, when Angela's case was moved to a fresh division that specialized in unsolved homicides. After meeting with the chief detective, Sheila started working on the case. She was shocked to discover that the victim's DNA sample had been stored in the lab all along and had not actually vanished. She had reportedly been deliberately deceived because she had worn out the detectives. Sheila's calls finally persuaded the new detective to send the DNA sample for analysis, but they were forced to wait almost 2 years for the results because of delays and red tape. The detective received the murderer's DNA profile on February 14, 2008, and entered it into the FBI database. They finally had the killer's name after 24 years because he saw an instant 100% match. Russell was supposed to be the murderer when the detective called Sheila to inform her of the situation, but to her surprise, the detective gave. Her name was completely unknown to me. Angela's DNA matched a sample belonging to a certain Donald Andrew Bass. The man, who was already older than 60, was imprisoned in 1977 for a string of rapes. Donald was sentenced to 25 years in prison for kidnapping and abusing a young woman. He was released early, as is frequently the case. At the start of 1984, he was released from prison after serving 7 years. He killed Angela in the same year, when he was 36, but went unpunished for many years. He assaulted a different woman in 1985. And the police managed to apprehend him. The fact that Donald was on parole when the crime was committed was used as an aggravating circumstance, and he received a life sentence. Thus, a year after Angela's murder, he was imprisoned. Detectives arrived at the correctional facility to interview inmates after compiling all the necessary information. Donald denied being a part of Angela's slaying, and adamantly asserted that he had never hurt women. Even though his semen was discovered on the victim's body, the investigators were slow to believe him. Nevertheless, the man resisted making a confession, and the case was eventually set up for trial. Due to significant health issues, the trial had to be delayed. A few days prior to the hearing, Donald had a heart attack, which delayed the start of the trial until June 2, 2010. Despite the DNA test results, Donald persisted in his denial that he had murdered anyone. In an effort to get Donald a lighter sentence, his attorney tried to highlight his health issues as well as his good behavior while he was incarcerated. The investigators claimed that the prosecution then requested the death penalty. After spotting Angela in one of the bars or on the street, Donald started to pursue her. He knocked on her apartment door when she got home and asked to use the phone in the bathroom after the young woman called her, after which she hung up. She was attacked and assaulted by Donald. When Angela's boyfriend arrived and began knocking on the door, the detectives thought the burglar was still inside her apartment. Donald may have stabbed his victim multiple times out of fear that they would scream. He left the apartment after waiting for her boyfriend to depart. The trial received extensive media coverage, which had some unexpected results. Several women reported Donald's best treatment of them to the police right away. One of them was his ex-wife, who reported to the court that Donald had been beating her frequently. Even while she was carrying his child, he touched her with his hand, and even after their daughter was born, he still physically abused her. In order to protect her child's life, the wife had to flee and hide. Because of this, the jury found him guilty of killing Angela, and he was given the death penalty. He repeatedly tried to appeal the court's ruling but was unsuccessful. During his additional 12 years behind bars, Donald, his execution date had not yet been determined at that point, but in October 2022, he passed away naturally after suffering another heart attack that proved fatal, bringing this complex case to a close. Sheila's persistence in seeking the truth was recognized by the investigators as having been essential in advancing the case. After her story went viral, family members of other victims whose cases had been open for years started contacting her. Sheila made the decision to assist these people as a result, and a non-profit organization was founded. Russell received a formal apology from the police department for the months of harassment. He acknowledged that it had a significant impact on his life and that his fear of being found guilty of a crime he did not commit was real. He persisted in trying to assist the police in solving the crime despite this. After all of these things happened, he rose to fame in Dallas as an architect. Investigators are still puzzled by one aspect of the story. Even though Donald spent a lot of time on the run, it's possible that he had many more victims. He spent 50% of his life behind bars. They might be able to connect him to other crimes sooner or later. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. It took 25 years to piece together this strange tale. After leaving a party, a student from American University vanished with no trace. Despite having a suspect since the beginning, the police were unable to establish his guilt. It wasn't until the podcast's creator dug up the horrific details of the case decades later that he alerted millions of people to it and forced the police to reopen their investigation. Kristen Smart moved to the United States with her parents after being born on February 20, 1977, in Augsburg, Germany. At a young age, the family moved to Stockton, California, with a brother and sister. Her parents had a daycare center for kids of American military personnel. In 1996, Kristen entered California Polytechnic University after receiving her high school diploma. She worked as a lifeguard at the campus recreation center in her free time. A large birthday celebration for one of the students was held at the fraternity house on May 25, 1996. When her friends decided against going, Kristen went to the fraternity house by herself. The event took place in typical American student fashion. A sizable group enjoyed themselves that evening by drinking, dancing, and listening to music. Two other students, Tim Davis and Cheryl Anderson, who had both been at the party, saw Kristen on the street and decided to walk her home after she overindulged and felt bad. At around 2 in the morning, Kristen went to her dorm because she could hardly walk by herself. Paul Flores, a fellow student who had also attended the party, joined them after a while and offered to walk Kristen to her dorm because he himself had not yet arrived. Lived closest to Cheryl and Tim bid them farewell before departing because they had to go in the opposite direction. Since then, nobody had seen Kristen alive. Her disappearance was not initially given much thought. Margarita Campos, Christine's roommate, was the first to express concern. After the party, she was certain that her friend would head back home, but she never did. The fact that Christine's belongings, including her wallet, bank card, and passport, were still in her room and she couldn't just pick them up and leave added to her anxiety. After the young woman vanished, Marguerite did not alert campus police until 2 days later. Campus police apparently didn't take her roommate's claim seriously, despite the fact that she apparently hoped up until the very last moment that Kristen was okay and would go home. It was the previous weekend, and the day before was the United States official Day of Remembrance, which honors fallen American service members. The fact that Kristen had left all of her valuables and important papers in the dorm did not cause any concern for the local police. They simply assumed that she had gone home. Separately, the distance between the university campus and Christine's hometown was 7 hours, making it too difficult to suddenly travel that far without money and identification, especially at night. A few days later, the neighborhood police made up their minds to report to work and called the parents of the young woman. The mother of Christine reported that her daughter had not called or visited the house in a while. The mother was alarmed by that call, and the parents went to the police. But even then, the police were reluctant to launch an inquiry. They claimed that since Christine had vanished not long ago, she might have been out with friends. The search didn't start until the 4th day after she vanished. First, but there were no results from the search. Paul Flores, who volunteered to accompany Chris to her dormitory door and was supposed to be the last person to see her, was the first person the police questioned. He told the investigators that after parting ways, SRI Kristen went to her dormitory and then to her house by herself. He allegedly went straight to bed after that, but this account quickly unraveled. Around 5 a.m., Paul's roommates observed him enter the bathroom, while he and Kristen parted ways after 2 a.m. The young man also had scratches on his knees and a black eye. When questioned by several people, he provided 3 different accounts of how he sustained all of these wounds. Despite the fact that Paul Flores seemed very suspicious, there was no concrete evidence against him. After Christine had been missing for a month, authorities had widened their search to include Christine's hometown. Because of the case's resemblance to the plot of the well-known TV show Twin, local journalists hyped it. Peaks: the young woman was killed by 2 men on campus, then driven to the cliff and thrown into the water, according to their version of events, which was even mentioned in the news. Of course, the police have no evidence to support these claims. Christine's parents filed a lawsuit against Flores a year after she vanished, accusing him of being involved in the teen's disappearance. Paul gave sworn testimony in 1997, but he only provided his name in response to one question out of all the others. Every other time, he invoked the Fifth Amendment, which prohibits the accused from testifying against him or herself. Then, Paul's parents sued Christine's family for moral damages, but neither of these lawsuits succeeded because the police lacked sufficient proof to bring charges against Paul. 6 years after Christine went missing, on May 25, 2002, the government declared her dead. They also made no progress toward cracking the case during that time. This continued until 2018, when Chris Lambert, a Californian, made the decision to launch his own podcast series on various crimes. He was 8 years old when Christine vanished, and he clearly recalled the spooky news report from that time. He made the decision to conduct his own investigation 22 years later and was shocked by how careless the police had been the entire time. Chris began by speaking with each of the witnesses to the incident. He discovered Paul Flores had a bad reputation from college students. Although the young man had repeatedly harassed female students, no official complaints were ever made. Chris further examined the police's actions and came to the following conclusion: that they had committed a number of serious mistakes. 2 months after the young woman vanished, the detectives did not show up at Ruben Flores, Paul's father. The police should have started an investigation into the residence right away, given that Paul was living with his father, but when they did show up to search it, they were very careless. The detectives failed to bring a forensic expert or a police canine trained to detect the smell of decay. The search was therefore essentially fruitless. The investigators also missed looking at the Flores family's 2 vehicles, one of which Paul might have used to transport Kristen from the campus to her father's home. One of the cars was sold, and the other was allegedly stolen a few months after the police visit. One of the key clues was hidden at Paul's mother's house, but the police never showed up there. 4 months after Kristen Smart vanished, Chris Lambert learned that Mary Lassiter, who had rented Paul's mother's home, had found a necklace link that was remarkably similar to the one Kristen was wearing. This necklace was also visible in photos that had been circulated throughout the city. Lassiter immediately took the evidence to the police, but they rejected it as evidence and later lost it entirely. The backyard at Paul's mother's house had always been concreted, but soon after the young woman vanished, a small piece of concrete was cut out, and a flower bed had been planted in that location. Mary Lassiter told Lambert an extremely unsettling tale every day since moving in. Mary had seen a very strange thing in the backyard of the house. Every day at the same time, at 4 a.m. and 4 p.m., I heard sounds emanating from that specific flower bed. She would hear a sound that resembled a wristwatch alarm, but it would soon stop, and it was probably the battery that had died. Christine's mother, Miss Smart, informed Chris that her daughter had set the alarm for 4:20 a.m. because she had to be at the recreation center for work at 5 that morning. Millions of people who listened to Lambert's podcast in 2019 were horrified by what they had heard, were affected by the police's carelessness and inaction. Even though there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, Chris' discovery shocked the audience even more. Since Paul Flores is still at large, the police have decided to reopen their inquiry into the disappearance of Kristen Smart. Investigators began by searching the homes and vehicles of the Flores family. When the unfortunate flower bed was finally dug up, no one was discovered inside. Even though there was no body, the experts were able to establish that on April 13, 2021, when Paul Flores and his father were detained, there were signs of human body decay in the ground. According to the investigation, Paul was charged with Christine's murder and his father was charged as an accessory. After Tim Davis and Cheryl Anderson left, Paul tried to molest the young woman but was rejected. This could account for the wounds Flores sustained during the altercation. Paul had the option of murdering Kristen and bringing her body home. The father of Flores made a decision after witnessing what his son had. They took the young woman to her mother's house and buried her in the backyard, which was later changed into a flower bed, to assist him in concealing the corpse. Later, the suspects dug up the grave and took the remains somewhere unknown. Apparently fearing harassment from the police. First-degree murder was found to have been committed by Paul Flores. He could be sentenced to 25 years to life in prison by a Monterey County jury. Ruben Flores, his father, was charged with being an accessory to the crime and could spend 3 years in jail. The parents of Christine published acknowledging Chris Lambert and all concerned parties for helping to ease the family's grief over the case's resolution despite the long period of time since their daughter vanished. One thing they ponder is whether Flores' mother was aware that her son had committed a crime. She didn't have any suspicions about the flower bed that had been unexpectedly planted in the backyard, or perhaps she had been aware of what had happened that night all along but had chosen to remain silent out of love for her son. Of course, there would be some unanswered questions, but that didn't matter right now. Maybe someday Kristen Smart will discover the remains of the young woman. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.